It did not come out of some new form of credit. We have had problems with our banks. We have had new forms of credit. But to try to limit the explanation to those things is, as I'll try to show you, a serious mistake. Another mistake, which follows from the first one. The distinction between Wall Street and Main Street. Frankly, I haven't the faintest idea what purpose this distinction makes, other than a kind of bizarre rhetoric that is completely contradicted by every fact. Let me assure you that in the hoopla of the last 5 or 6 years, everybody had their fingers in the pot. The little bank on Main Street was every bit as deep into this as the big bank on Wall Street. Indeed, the two banks were constantly working out the deal together. Their only disagreement was on how to divide the big rich pot between them. Every business in America was dependent on this wild boom. Not just banks, everybody. Little statistic. 2/3 of the economic upswing of the last 4 or 5 years before everything went bad was located in what we call in economics the housing industry. What does that mean? It means building homes, building the furniture that goes in the home, making the appliances that go in the home, making the automobile that sits in the driveway next to the home. Our economy was dependent on the housing industry. It accounted for 3/4 of the job growth. And how was it possible for housing to boom? Because of the banks and the credit system that made that possible. The banks made money, but the housing industry made money. And with the housing industry, the transportation, and on and on. Everybody was involved. Now that everything turned sour, everybody's pointing somewhere else where the blame lies. They weren't pointing when the times were good. Everybody got in on it. And everybody is now in deep trouble. The notion of a distinction between Wall Street and Main Street is bizarre and seems to me only understandable as an attempt, again, to localize, to minimize, to not face that this is a systemic problem. How did we get here? If you will bear with me, we economists are kind of spastic, and if we can't draw something on the board, we feel as though we're not doing our job. So it'll be very minimal. I will not bore you with mathematical fanciness. Our profession is completely polluted by that mentality, but I won't foist it on you. Here's the problem. For a long time, from about 1820 to 1970, that's a long time, 150 years, the United States was a remarkable capitalist country. Because here's what happened. If you look at those 150 years, they're remarkable because every decade, 10 year, 10 year, 10, every decade, the real wages of American workers on average went up. By real wage, I mean the amount of money they got paid in relationship to the prices they had to pay for the goods they bought with that money. The real wage. Money wages adjusted for prices. In other words, the American working class did better every year, even in the Great Depression. Because even though the wages went down, the prices went down even a bit more. It's remarkable. There's probably no working class in modern capitalist history that had 150 years of unbroken rising wages. It made Americans bizarre. Well, it did. It made them very different because nobody else had this. For example, Americans began to think that there was something peculiar about the United States. It just was, ready, blessed. Well, Americans being what they are, you have to explain it in the most readily available way. You look up. We're blessed. God likes us better than anybody else. Well, that was very popular, that view. Here's another view. Americans work hard. Or Americans just have, oh, this is good, leftists like this one. We're just sort of democratic. Why that has anything to do with this, I never understood, but it's one of those things, it makes it about as much sense as the looking up. No less sense, anyway. But be that as it may, Americans got used to it. Not a tough thing to get used to. Americans began to believe that it's somehow built into your condition as an American that the grandchildren will not be as well off as, the grandchildren will be better off than the children, and the children will be better off than the parents. It just gets better. Whatever kind of house you have, your kids will have a nicer one. And whatever kind of car you have, etc., etc. It was expected. And a population that lives like that can be forgiven if it develops the following idea. I measure my success in life by the neighborhood I live in, the house I have, the clothes I wear, the car I drive. I can show you that I'm a successful person. Look! Right? Americans, more than any other people on earth, measure their own sense of importance, their wealth as human beings by what they have. They're much more focused on the object than on relationships, important as relationships are. Americans, as everyone who has ever thought about it knows, are very consumption-oriented. There's a reason why the advertising industry was born in this country and has never elsewhere become as important in any culture as it is here. Right? So that's where I want to begin the story. For most of these 150 years, we can draw two lines that look very similar, the way I've done them here. The upper line is the growth in the productivity per worker. Very simple idea. The bunch of goods and services each worker produces. And the line goes up because over time, workers get better trained, have better and more machinery, so of course each worker produces more and more stuff. And for those 150 years, the line below is the line of the rising wages. As workers became more productive, they shared in the extra output their labor was able to produce. Their wages went up for 150 years. American capitalism was a charmed place. Then in the mid-1970s, that history stopped. And I would argue that most Americans still have not figured it out and certainly not come to terms in their own minds with it. Glimpses, people have all kinds of bits and pieces of the story, but they kind of don't see the story as a whole. Why did, by the way, just for the record, from the mid-1970s to the present, the real wages of the American working class have gone exactly nowhere. The amount of money an average worker gets in the United States today, adjusted for the prices he or she pays, is a little less than it was in the late 1970s, right now. That's shown here by having this line flatten out. It doesn't go up anymore. This is the wage line. This is the productivity line. Workers kept becoming more and more productive in the last 30 years. That's the era of the computer. 30 years ago, everybody didn't have a computer. Now everybody does. And because everybody has a computer, we are able to have each person produce a lot more than he or she could before. So the productivity, the amount of stuff produced by each worker keeps going up. But the wage doesn't. Why? Several reasons. In the 1970s, remember, we were a good 25, 30 years after World War II. The end of World War II, every country that might have competed with the United States was destroyed. The big other capitalist countries, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, wiped out. The United States had a fantastic free time from the 1945 end of the war to the 1970s was a charmed time. The rest of the world had to slowly rebuild its economies by buying American stuff. Americans had the job to produce. But by the 1970s, the rest of the world